Feudalism, the static system that dominated medieval Europe, covered all aspects of life, making it a political, economic, social, and military system. European feudalism, or the manorial system, can be traced back to as early as the 8th century under the Carolingian dynasty, which ruled France and parts of Italy and Spain. Feudalism didn't spread on a mass scale until the 10th century, in the wake of the spread of Christianity and the Norman conquest of England, which is where feudalism reached its peak. The foundation of the feudal system is a strict hierarchy, made up of the Pope at the top, the king, who derived divine power to land ownership from the Pope, nobles, who acted on behalf of the king and regulated manners, knights, vassals, and lords, who traded loyalty or military service to the king for land or a fief, and peasants, serfs, or villeins, who were bound to the land they worked. Feudalism was political in the sense that with the lack of large-scale empires, the regional system protected the people from regional threats. Economic in the sense that the money produced by producing agricultural products flowed up to the king. Social because the rigid hierarchy presented a very rigid class system with zero social mobility, and militaristic in the establishment of armies and military-based service. This form of feudalism remained prevalent until the fall of the Middle Ages, when new economic and cultural systems arose due to the Black Plague and the fragmentation of the church.
Peasants, the backbone of medieval agrarian feudal society, made up the majority of the population and spent their lives used and taken advantage of by the upper rankings of society.
Peasants lived lives of constant toil. An average day began as early as 3 a.m. in the summer, followed by a simple breakfast of pottage or bread, and work in the fields was begun by dawn. Depending on whether crops were in season or not, peasants would typically spend most of their days working in fields. Peasants had a wealth of work tasks, which could include reaping, sowing, plowing, binding and thatching, haymaking, threshing, and hedging, which took up most of the day and ended at dusk, outside work that is. Peasant women spent a great amount of time weaving and spinning clothes for their families. Common garb for men included a tunic, short breeches, sometimes long trousers, and for women was often a long shift made out of wool or linen. Over this they would wear a sleeveless woolen tunic, usually secured at the shoulder with straps or brooches.
Living conditions were often poor, and houses were made out of straw, sticks, and mud. Families often lived in one-room houses with animals.
Whole grains made up the greater part of a peasant's diet, along with vegetables. Peasants namely ate buckwheat, oats, barley, and rye, which they used to make peasant bread, a heavier, denser bread compared to the wheat breads of the wealthy, along with vegetables such as turnips, onions, and garlic. Peasants had little time for leisure. Leisure activities included annual festivals and jousts. Peasants would also eat together as a family, a form of leisure.
Becoming a knight was a long and tedious process that began as early as 6 or 7 years old.
The young knight-to-be would report to the local lord's manor in order to begin his knight's training as a page. At around 13, he becomes a squire, and when ready, eventually becomes a knight. Because knights often came from well-off families and were highly valued for their fighting skills, they ended up in a very high class in feudal society, and were recognized as sir. Their social class was just below the nobles, who gave them land in exchange for their protection. Nobles pledged their loyalty to the king, and in a way, the knights rose to their status by protecting the king's land. In order to be able to fight the best that they could, they had to be in the best shape, and that included their diet.
They were required to follow the primitive rule of Templars, which was a rulebook of how knights should take care of themselves, and told them what to eat and when they should eat it.
They ate mostly rice and vegetables, and were only allowed to eat meat twice a week, and fish on Fridays. Family life for the knights was surprisingly simple. The families were considered to be quite small. The couple typically married for love, and every day the family would go to mass. The male children of the knights would usually grow up to also become knights in their father's footsteps.
The king had absolute authority over his kingdom and answered only to the Pope.
While his power was relatively weaker in the early medieval ages, the influence of the church gave way for increased royal power into the Middle Ages. Daily life for the king always began with prayers and mass in the castle's chapel. Religion was incredibly important to the ruling class, as they felt inclined to rule by divine right and were grateful to God for everything. After Mass, the king would begin his breakfast, a feast of a variety of foods. Meat and bread were the most prevalent foods on the king's breakfast table, but vegetables, seafood, and cereal were not uncommon. Because of the king's immense wealth, delicacy items such as honey and spices could be afforded to make cooking more flavorful. The king's day would continue on to his attendance of the council meetings, where different affairs of the kingdom would be discussed. The king's primary duty was to keep his kingdom protected from enemies, so discussion of war strategy was often the talk that occurred in these daily meetings. The king spent the rest of his day doing a variety of leisure activities. He often took advantage of his expansive castle grounds to go horseback riding and hunting. He also passed time playing chess, checkers, and dice games. Royal dress was heavily inspired by the Romans and Greeks, so the royal family often wore loose-belted clothes accompanied by coats of mail and expensive materials such as velvet. Quality of life was high for people of the royal class, and they rarely had any problems that could not be handled by servants or other subordinates.